All right. Well, good morning, everyone. I just want to welcome you to our. Thank you for joining us for this webinar that we are beginning the Ag Exchange. I oh, I'm getting a little feedback because sorry about I'm listening to it on other stations, and so I'll adjust that. It's a learning curve. But I'm Ben Tyndall, and I appreciate the everyone tuning in and joining us for this webinar. I am the executive director for Save Family Farming. We are a agriculture advocacy and communications organization based out of Washington State. This is a kind of a first of a series that we're putting out and hosting. We're going to plan on hosting regular webinars to really have good, powerful conversations, share some perspectives on issues that are important to agriculture and farmers in Washington State, as well as hoping to be informative and helpful to engage the non-farming community and inform about the issues facing the agriculture community and those that are providing food and clothing and fiber to us all. But this morning, I do want to thank our sponsor. We are sponsored by the Kennewick Irrigation District. They are a valuable partner with Save Family Farming, and we're very grateful for them coming on board with us. So again, thank you, and a big shout out to the Kennewick Irrigation District for their continued partnership with us. We are here today for what I think is going to be a very valuable and it's a very viable conversation to the Save Family Farming community. We have been working in the area of the EPA and identifying and just working to really address some of the issues and the relationship that the agriculture community can have with this environmental protection agency. And so this morning, I'm very excited to bring on our guest for the conversation this morning. We're going to be hearing and visiting with Darren Baxt. He is the director of the Competitive Enterprise Institute's Center for Energy and Environment. He manages and develops and leads the coalition and research activities for the center. So he is an author, a podcaster, and someone who has been an advocate for energy and environment policy, food and agricultural policy, regulation, trade. So he has a slew of areas that he has been actively engaged in for decades. He is a commentator on numerous media areas, such as the Wall Street Journal, the U.S. Today, the Washington Times, CNN, and U.S. News and World Report. He holds degrees from Washington University, the University of Miami, and American University, and is a licensed attorney. So I want to, I appreciate that. The conversation this morning will be around the book that just came out, Modernizing the EPA, a Blueprint for Congress. This is a book that Darren and several others co-authored. If you are interested in reading this book and viewing it, you can use the QR code there to access the book online. It is a resource that the Competitive Enterprise Institute has put out, and it is available on their website. Use that QR code to access the book. But this will be what we use to kind of ground our conversation this morning. And so I want to encourage you to use that resource and take advantage of that. But I want to bring on Darren. And Darren, thank you so much for joining us this morning and being a part of this kind of maiden voyage, this start to our webinar series. Appreciate you taking the time. Really want to just kind of jump into the conversation about this book. So kind of walk us through what was maybe the catalyst for this book, and tell us a little bit about the team that maybe put that together.
Well, first of all, Ben, thank you for the invitation. I appreciate it. And yeah, the catalyst. Well, I think when you're thinking about federal agencies and those that have kind of the biggest effect on our lives, you kind of have to think about the EPA. Here at CEI, we're focused on trying to reform the administrative state and reducing the scope of regulations. The EPA is an agency whose the cost of their rules actually constitute a majority of all the regulatory costs across the entire federal government. Just one agency, and that's the EPA. And it's not simply just the cost that's the issue when it comes to EPA, it's how they affect our lives in terms of dictating maybe how we farm our land or even how the economy can function based on kind of the scope of their regulations. So we are looking on trying to look at reforming the administrative state. A great place to start is the EPA. That's what we did. Obviously, I work at the Center for Energy and Environment here at CEI, so I was biased. We want to look at an environmental agency, so it's the EPA, and that's kind of what inspired us to do it.
That's fantastic. Can you tell me a little bit about the intended audience? So what is what is the intent now that the book is published, it is out, you have a hard copy in front of you, it's available online. Tell me a little bit about what do you hope, who will read this book? Who is the intended audience, and what are your
Yeah,
hopes for the outcome?
admittedly, the top audience, is the Hill. It's a blueprint of legislative reforms, really, and it's meant for lawmakers and people that are staffers on the Hill. However, a lot of the recommendations are something that an administration can also apply. A lot of the things are specific to, like, here's what Congress can do, but the administration can do a lot of things as well, even though it's not as good as legislation, because legislation is the law and it's actually harder to get rid of. But it is written in a fairly accessible way. So we're trying to not just simply reach the Hill, but also people in the DC community, and also just folks that are interested and affected by the EPA. So I do think it's a fairly accessible book, even though the main audience really is specifically for policymakers.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that kind of I've looked through the book, read through it. In chapter 1 of the book, it opens with this powerful statement that I wanted to read to you, taken from the EPA's own peer review handbook, which states, "Science is the foundation that supports all of our work at EPA." Okay, but your book kind of shows that that foundation is cracked a little bit, and there's politics and institutional biases seems to have somewhat kind of replaced some of the objectivity. So, from your perspective, where has EPA strayed away from its own standard of scientific integrity? And again, I'm assuming that was kind of played into the catalyst a bit of why you wrote this book. But how has it strayed?
Yeah, if we just think about, first of all, agencies generally, they're always trying to, oftentimes, they're trying to exceed the power given to them by Congress. So we want them to actually be acting consistent with the statute and the will of Congress. But given the fact that they're kind of doing their own thing and pushing things, we also want them to inform whatever they do using sound science. Otherwise, that becomes a problem, and then we start to lose faith in the agency itself and the government. I think the agency has had a problem with science for a long time, and it's not simply just the EPA. In fairness, it's across the federal government, and also even in the scientific community generally, there are significant problems where a lot of them, we think of conflicts of interest and think of like corporate interests or other special interests affecting the research. But the agency itself has a conflict of interest, because what they're doing is they wind up funding a lot of research, and they're also regulators as well. So a lot of the research that they try to push is helping them to justify their regulations. So in many ways, they have a huge conflict. There's also just some simple flaws with the science that we can discuss as well.
Yeah, no, that's good. I know in the book, speaking of the kind of the scientific process, the book calls for a reassessment of the science that's used by the agency. The book mentions a, quote, reproducibility crisis, end quote, and that many of the studies used to justify new rules, they actually can't be verified. I really appreciated this quote from the book. It said, quote, irreproducible research is not really science, and non-transparent science is not reproducible, end quote. So let me ask you, how serious is that problem, and how can EPA restore credibility in the science it uses?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me that. So my colleague Marlo Lewis wrote that sentence and wrote the science chapter. And he's right. If we think about what actually constitutes science, it's the ability, to evaluate how a researcher got to its conclusion. It's something that's testable, that we should be able to reproduce it, replicate it, and see if it actually is sound. The problem is that a lot of the science that the agency uses cannot be reproduced at all. The public, through the regulatory process, the public provides comments, and they're supposed to be able to evaluate how the agency makes certain conclusions. But the public doesn't even have access to underlying data, models, even a lot of the assumptions, which is a big deal because you then can't figure out whether or not the science that's being used by the agency is even sound. Now, Congress has recognized a problem with reproducibility for a long time. I mean, at least 20 something years at a minimum. And they passed a law that I won't get into details with, called the Information Quality Act, that in many ways tried to address some of these problems, but it hasn't worked, to be honest. Now, Congress, I might provide more information than you need, but I'm giving you a little history here on um, the policymakers are aware of some of these problems. The House Science Committee over the years has they had a bill called Secret Science Act, something like call that, and then they had something called the Honest Act, and that actually passed the House, I think, in 2018. And what it did is it requires the EPA to ensure that the public has access to these underlying data models to make things transparent so people can evaluate the science that's informing the regulations, because these studies that the agency is using is actually informing policies that affect all of our lives. Now, the Trump administration in the first term did something called, they had their transparency rule, and they unfortunately finalized it very late in the first term. And what it did is try to address the reproducibility problem as well. As you might imagine, given that it was late in the Trump administration, the Biden administration didn't go out and defend it when inevitably the Trump administration got sued and there was a challenge. So that rule just kind of died. So now what at CEI, what we're trying to do is we're trying to work with not only folks on the Hill, but also the administration to really focus on this reproducibility crisis. There was a study that journal Nature did, and let's just see if I got some numbers here. So they surveyed a bunch of active researchers. I think 52% of these researchers that journal Nature studied, not exactly a conservative journal or anything like that, 52% said there's a significant crisis with reproducibility. I think 38% said there's a slight crisis. So about 90% are recognizing the crisis. Only 3% said there is no crisis. So this is not necessarily about the EPA. This is about science generally, like the whole all these different academic fields. So don't want to just pick on the EPA, but the EPA uses these studies, and it's therefore very important that they ensure the integrity of the science that's being used by the agency.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I want us to I have a question now. We'll kind of transition to chapter 2, kind of about that intent or purpose of the EPA. I do want to take just a quick second to any individuals that may be viewing. There will be an opportunity for questions near the end of our webinar here. If you do have any questions, you are able to simply type in the comments in whatever platform you're viewing. Simply type those in, and we'll try to answer some questions from our viewers at the end. So just want to give anyone who's viewing this that opportunity. So feel free to send in your questions, and we'll have a bit of a Q&A at the end. With that, Darren, let me ask you this. In chapter 2, you talked about the science area and the integrity or scientific integrity that's necessary, but really you write in the chapter 2 of the book that the EPA is operating more like an economic planning agency more than an environmental protection agency. Can you kind of unpack what that means, and where do you see EPA kind of expanding beyond their intended scope?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is in many ways the biggest reason why we probably wrote the book. That line is from our Clean Air Act chapter. So I was telling you that the EPA accounts for most of the regulatory costs across the entire government. The air office, so the air regulations account for about 98% or so of the EPA's regulatory costs. So when you're thinking about the costs, it's usually from the air regulations. And there are a lot of reasons, but one of the biggest reasons why the agency's a bit of a problem is they have asserted the authority to regulate greenhouse gases. And this is obviously a big issue now here in DC and what the Trump administration is trying to do with, I won't get too far in the weeds on it, but the EPA is regulating greenhouse gases. The ability to regulate greenhouse gases is really in many ways the ability to regulate the entire economy. 83% of our energy in the US comes from fossil fuels, and fossil fuels emit greenhouse gases. And if you really think about it, there's really no industry that doesn't rely upon fossil fuels. So if the EPA has this authority to regulate greenhouse gases, and really the goal is to kind of, if you're going to regulate it, the greenhouse gas emissions is just kind of to stop it, then you're trying to, in effect, dictate and restrict development and limit the ability across the economy for all different industries to emit greenhouse gases. So it's not what Congress ever intended. It wasn't meant. The Clean Air Act is, quite honestly, the Supreme Court in a case called Massachusetts versus EPA, which said the agency had the authority to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act, like if they found that these emissions endangered public health and welfare, which is a whole other issue. The Supreme Court got it wrong, but that's what they concluded. We'll see what happens. But that's kind of a big problem. They become, and there's no limiting principle. There's no way to kind of rate. There's no real rating it in. In fact, I should just bring up that not to get too legal in the weeds, but there was a Supreme Court case not very long ago called West Virginia versus EPA, and it dealt with the Obama administration's power plant rule, and it was its ability to kind of regulate greenhouse gases from power plants. And the goal was, and what they try to do is they were trying to, in effect, act as the nation's grid manager, effectively killing off, especially like coal power plants. And that's what they did. And the Supreme Court ultimately decided, using something called the major questions doctrine, that the agency went too far. And the reason why is that Congress wanted EPA to basically act as the nation's grid manager and try to control all these electricity sources. And Congress would have spoke clearly and directly about that. And because they didn't, the court is not going to therefore assume that there's in fact the authority to do so. So these EPA is going to be given the scope of what they've been doing, like the Biden administration's de facto EV mandate, that's also based on this desire to regulate greenhouse gases. You're going to continuously have these major question doctrine problems where the agency is continuously going way beyond what Congress ever would have wanted. If Congress wanted the EPA to basically, in effect, kill off gas-powered cars like the Biden administration was doing, it would have said so. Now, I don't want Congress to do that, but I certainly don't want the EPA to do it on its own without proper statutory authority.
Yeah. Well, talking about clean air, let me ask it. So one of the lines in the book that that kind of struck me, it says the United States has clean air. Over 50 years ago, nobody could have accurately made that claim. However, for decades, the nation's air quality has continuously improved and is now cleaner than the air quality in almost every other country, end quote. So air quality in the United States is already among the cleanest, arguably, in the world, and yet the agency continues to tighten the standards. Why is that? Why don't they? Yeah, why would they continue to tighten things when we're already doing really well? It sounds like.
Yeah, just to kind of stress, I mean, this idea of the air quality getting better is not really, nobody can honestly question that, and we've made so much improvement in decades that it's the EPA is the EPA's own data, and both sides will acknowledge this. At least they should. It's the truth. They're one of the pollutants that is a big concern for some is something called particulate matter. It's like fine particulate matter. It's referred to as PM 2.5. So a lot of times that becomes like you look at whether or not what the PM 2.5 concentration levels are, the U.S. has PM2, our concentration levels are incredibly low. So all these countries like in the EU that want to complain about environmental issues, or the U.S., whatever, we kick their, well, let's just say we beat them pretty badly when it comes to air quality and PM 2.5. So our air quality is a lot better than these European countries. And there's like, I think maybe three EU countries that might be better with air quality. But like in the whole world, we're like the top. I mean, right near the top. I mean, and really, when you think about how productive we are and the economic growth, economic development, and our economy, you take that into account and adjust for that, we really are the top. Now, people will conflate air quality with greenhouse gases. Uh, Greenhouse gases have absolutely, and carbon dioxide have absolutely nothing to do with air quality. Carbon dioxide is an invisible and odorless gas. And, I actually I was in some conversation with a few people recently, and somebody who I thought should know better was talking about, well, I don't want to have to breathe in or be carbon dioxide. That doesn't make any sense. Again, that's not the issue with carbon dioxide. It's, again, invisible and odorless gas. You'll see, like, in media accounts, like they'll show a power plant and all this dirty air or whatever. That's not carbon dioxide. So people conflate and confuse that. That helps, I think, the EPA to justify greenhouse gas regulations. But getting back to actually what are, in fact, pollutants that we're talking about are what are called criteria pollutants. Those are the, like, PM 2.5, as I said, ground level ozone, lead, continuously steep declines in all of this. And the reason why the EPA keeps doing it is every 5 years you have to review and, if appropriate, revise the standards for these pollutants. If you're an agency, you're not willing to give up your power. You're just going to keep moving the goalposts constantly every single time. So, like, usually when you have a Democratic administration, they'll move the goalpost. The Republican administration doesn't want to, and it just becomes, we're at the point where we're almost at background levels. Like, in other words, there's nothing more you can do, and so it's huge costs to make any type of improvements for very marginal gain.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Well, I know. Let me ask this. You mentioned administrations. Now, one of the things that in the book, at the end of each chapter, and you mentioned the kind of key audience, or identify the target audience as ultimately individuals on Capitol Hill in Congress. And I know at the end of each chapter, you identify key issues and suggestions and kind of takeaways and action steps that really our leaders could implement addressing clean air or water or pesticides, whatever the issue of that particular chapter was. For this, what can Congress do to kind of help draw the line between, and kind of a stronger line between, environmental protection and this kind of overstretch into economic sustainability?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the ideal is that the EPA shouldn't be able to regulate greenhouse gases.
Sure.
Now, I'm not expecting that anytime soon. I think one of the key recommendations is to have what I call guardrails on the EPA, so that in fact, that's one of the key recommendations. So if we believe that Congress never would have authorized the agency to use its power to kill off gas-powered cars, or to act as the nation's grid manager, or to impose technological requirements that are infeasible to meet, then let's just say that very clearly in law and statute that the agency cannot issue those types of regulations. So you establish some limiting principles and guardrails to ensure, okay, if the agency, okay, you can regulate, but you can't go beyond a certain level. The other thing, this may surprise people, is in many instances, the agency is sometimes not allowed to consider costs when it establishes regulations, or whether or not to regulate. Or if they do, they don't have to give much weight to it. I think it's very important, especially at this point, that the EPA is always considering the adverse effects of its regulations. Um, I'm not even saying to give it more weight than the benefits, but it's simply consider the adverse effects of what you're doing, and that should be given significant weight, and that should go into the decisions. Everything we do has costs and trade-offs, and that is especially important when it comes to air regulation. Now, 50 years ago, it may have been like it might have low-hanging fruit to try to improve air quality. Therefore, we may not have seen too many costs because there have been so many benefits. It was just easy to just say, go regulate EPA. But here, given that we've made so much improvements, you don't have these low-hanging fruits. It's significantly costly. It's huge costs. Even like these criteria, like a PM 2.5 standard, if you make it stricter, costs a fortune. It's almost impossible really to address it realistically without imposing huge costs. You're gonna get very little gain. Science informing it is very questionable, to say the least. So you know what? If you're going to make these huge types of decisions, then you should consider the costs. Now, really, what should happen though, especially when it comes to the criteria of pollutants that I was talking about, given the scope of these rules at this point, and I'd say just the cost of them, these are decisions that Congress should be making. At this point, EPA should not be making these types of decisions. Congress can, and furthermore, it's important to stress that states can always go beyond what the EPA sets. So if the EPA sets a standard, it's a floor, but the states can always go above the floor, and nobody would be prohibiting states from doing so.
Yeah. Oh, I appreciate that. That makes sense. Well, let me ask this. So one of the areas, so the kind of the, if I remember right, the third chapter, the next chapter talks about water. And so water, for similar to clean air, but water in particular, when it comes to farming, when it comes to agriculture, is a key issue. And this chapter really hit home for those of us who are involved and engaged in agriculture. It really details the EPA's interpretation of the Clean Water Act, and it's kind of become I guess a bit of a case study in overreach by the EPA, in my opinion. The book makes kind of says the agency has in essence stretched the Clean Water Act beyond the boundaries of common sense, and like you're directing, beyond the boundaries of congressional intent. This one quote from the book, it states this, it says, quote, when Congress made these decisions in the 1970s, it left some ambiguities around the edges. In the ensuing years, both the EPA and Army Corps exploited those ambiguities to facilitate their mission creep. I like that term, to pursue maximal environmental protection and maximal economic disruption in places and activities that Congress never intended. The agency reinterpreted the term navigable waters to include millions of acres of features that not only are obviously not navigable, but are also not even water for more than a few weeks or even days a year, end quote. So, okay, let's start there. How did EPA's interpretation of the WOTUS, Waters of the United States, drift so far from what Congress actually meant?
Yeah, so I've worked a lot on Clean Water Act issues and actually in relation to agriculture. So it's certainly an issue close to my heart, and you can see the practical effects it has on just farmers, but also on homeowners and just ordinary people. That's one of the things about the Clean Water Act and the permitting requirements is it more than any maybe of the statutes really affects the ordinary person more than, at least directly affects them more than others. The EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers, they both kind of regulate under the Clean Water Act. They have just constantly taken a more expansive view of what navigable waters means. And really, so navigable waters is defined as waters in the United States and the territorial seas. So really the key term it's kind of important not to forget that it's really navigable waters, but the focus is always on what is waters in the United States mean. And they have just kind of gone overboard with it. You know, one of the right at the start of the Clean Water Act is language that stresses the importance that states are supposed to play the primary role when it comes to regulating water. Congress envisioned that, but really what's happened is the EPA and the Corps have decided that they're not going to trust the states. They're going to have the federal government try to regulate every water imaginable, and they have lost repeatedly at the Supreme Court regarding with this overreach. They're in that line about not even regulating waters. That's true. I mean, they have tried to regulate what many people will look at as a puddle, or look at something that looks like it's basically dry land the entire year, except for maybe a couple of days a year because of a heavy rainfall. There might be some water accumulated. That would be an ephemeral water and therefore regulated. Now, fortunately, in 2023, the Supreme Court, in a case called Sackett versus EPA, the Supreme Court finally provided some clarity, and they favorably, let's say, supported a previous case called Rapanos versus the United States, the plurality opinion that Justice Scalia wrote. So really, we do now have some clarity as to what waters in the United States means. It just, I don't want to get too in the weeds again, but one of the key issues is to what extent wetlands are regulated under the under the Clean Water Act. And it's important to know that wetlands are not like a separate category of water that is regulated. The only reason why a wetland would ever be regulable, something you could regulate, is only because it is because of its connection to a relatively permanent water, something like a lake, stream, or river, and you can't tell where that lake, stream, river, where it ends and land begins. So it's just that difficult area where you can't even tell where, again, the water ends, land begins. That's why, to the extent that that's the case, then the wetland can be regulated. But it's not a separate category by itself. You can't regulate a wetland that's somewhat close to a lake or whatever, or stream. It's not even actually that the wetland has to be adjacent. It's more than that. It can't simply be adjacent. It has to be to the point where the wetland, like, you literally just can't even tell the difference where the lake again ends, or the stream, whatever it might be, and the wetland begins. That's a really important point. The wetland stuff is really how they've gotten farmers and all kinds of property owners as well. And the other thing is the language is relatively permanent waters. That comes from the Rapanos case, and the Sackett court again supports what was said in the plurality opinion of Rapanos. So you're talking about relatively permanent waters. You've got things that are ordinary course, ordinary presence of water, all these things that basically suggest that you would expect water to be there almost all the time. So that does not lend itself to, like what I said, ephemeral waters, like these kind of things like the puddles that we keep, or things that you would normally look at and think of as land most of the time. Mm-hmm. Also, in Rapanos, the court rejected intermittent waters. So waters are just kind of sporadically kind of running or around, like maybe part of the year. So even intermittent waters are not covered. There's some exception that, but basically they've really narrowed the scope of what waters are regulated in those opinions. And to be clear, these opinions are just being consistent with what Congress wanted. It's what's, and the idea is not, we're not saying that these waters shouldn't be regulated in any way. They maybe or maybe not, but it's the states would fill in the gaps if they think it is appropriate. The people that live in the states are closer to the water issues and the concerns, and they have the interest and to decide whether or not they want to regulate some of these things that are a little bit more disconnected to what we would normally think of as actually water. It's important to recognize that Congress's power is connected to the Commerce Clause and interstate commerce. So it becomes, the EPA and the court try to regulate waters that are like intrastate, like within the state, or have very little connection to some type of water that has anything to do with interstate. So it's just from a legal perspective, from the statute and even the Constitution, it's not appropriate for the EPA or the Corps to be regulating these waters. And fortunately, I should point out that the Trump administration will be coming out with a new WOTUS rule very soon, and we've been waiting for it. We do expect it to come out soon, and we'll see whether or not it is consistent with the Sackett versus EPA decision. I'm hoping it is, and if it's not, we'll certainly make our thoughts known to make sure that it is consistent with Sackett versus EPA.
Well, kind of let me ask this, just playing off that, one, talking about the federal government has the ability to regulate navigable waters here on the Washington. One of our key issues when it comes to water regulation is fish habitat, and there's a lot of regulation around anything that is fish bearing, and yet there's this kind of stretching similarly where the government is able to regulate non fish bearing waters because they have some sort of hydrological connection to fish bearing water, or similarly with navigable waters. Well, we can regulate this little puddle over here because through some form of chain it's gonna somehow in some way impact navigable waters somewhere out there. We can even in a almost ludicrous or comical train of thought. So can you kind of, what's the problem with that kind of approach, both scientifically and practically? Anyway, can you break that down?
Again, there's no limiting principle. Again, you just keep making that argument over and over again. It's a way to abuse, to be inconsistent with the statute itself. It allows you to try to make the case for being able to regulate waters have absolutely nothing to do with interstate commerce or kind of what more normal person would think of as natural water, lake, stream, river. I mean, that's kind of like the big, that's what the court was saying is like, we're trying, this statute is supposed to be covering regulating waters that like the average person should look at and say, oh yeah, that's a lake, that's a river. Not, what, I shouldn't have to get aerial photographs to figure out whether or not some water, there's natural water there that's regulated, or to have to look at like underwater or whatever. I mean, there's aerial photographs, there's GPS like programs and whatever. Like, no, that's not the point. I mean, property owners are the ones that face severe penalties, like farmers face severe penalties if they didn't properly get a permit for what's a dredge and fill permit, Section 404 permit. And really what Section 4 permits are dirt moving activities. This is not what people think of. They're not polluting pristine waters here. We're not talking about that. We're talking about somebody who wants to build a house. So they have to get a dredge and fill permit, and they didn't do what the Corps and EPA wanted. They wind up facing severe penalties and even potentially criminal penalties. And these are really innocent property owners. And so there's a lot of due process protections that that need to be addressed, and we need to protect these innocent property owners. And the same thing with farmers being able to just farm the land. You find out, oops, EPA and Corps say you can't plow the land. That violates, that's a wetland, and you're in serious trouble, and you got to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars of fines. And if you don't, then even criminal penalties are possible. That's just we shouldn't tolerate that.
Yeah, no, and that's a good line. Really, we shouldn't tolerate that. We shouldn't, as citizens. I would hope our representatives would understand that as well. I do want to pause real quick and just remind anyone that's viewing, if you do have any questions about any of this information or questions for Darren specifically, please make sure and insert that question in the comments section of whatever platform you're viewing. We'll be getting to those Q&A here in a minute that come in. But Darren, let me ask you this, with kind of moving more maybe into the regulation side and some of maybe the more practical, tangible elements, kind of the latter half of that report that y'all put together. One, it talks about kind of the more of the politics, I guess, and the risks and the regulations. One of the struggles that a lot of farmers can feel is that the EPA really treats farmers as these kind of industrial polluters, that we are, farmers are polluting the air, they're polluting the water as they're trying to grow food. How should one, from the agency perspective, if you could, kind of put on your EPA hat and channel that, how should the agency distinguish between genuine pollution and ordinary agricultural activity that really is not polluting the environment?
I think that there is a negative um, viewpoint of perspective on farming and American farmers, primarily from the left. Um, one, I mean, I've written about this in different contexts. I think that there's really, I think American farmers should feel almost an existential um, concern over efforts by like the previous the Biden administration. I think is a good example of trying to kind of dictate how Americans, how farmers farm the land. So they were pushing like climate smart agriculture practices, or giving money for organic farming. And if you're not doing that, then that's a problem. Or buying into these international kind of agreements or policies to worry about things like climate issues or uh, equity issues as it relates to farming, or things that have absolutely nothing to do with actually producing food. And then you look at like the USDA document from during the Biden administration, like, and talking about like priorities and stuff, like just the idea that the production side is like very low on the list. These other things that are unrelated to agriculture are up on the near the top. And where's the concern about production? Where's the concern about making sure we feed Americans in the world, and just allowing people and farmers to actually make the choices and to be the ones with respect to farm the land? There's nothing like that. And it gets back kind of to the climate discussion that we have before in the regulation of greenhouse gases, that there's really no consideration of the costs and trade-offs. It's just simply they're pushing a certain agenda, and these costs and trade-offs just are not relevant. So if it drives up food prices, or whatever it might be, it just seemed to be as big of a deal as it really needs to be. It doesn't seem to be the focus. So I would just say that we shouldn't be kind of picking on any group, regardless of farming or industry or whatever it might be. But we should be addressing genuine, tangible, direct environmental problems. So if the EPA can genuinely point to specific practices that are problematic, then that's something that needs to be addressed. But I think, unfortunately, there's just kind of this built-in bit of bias that may pervade some folks. And I think you definitely do see that again with in the clean water area as it relates to the federal, thinking that the only way to address water issues is the federal government to address the water issues, not the states or farmers or property owners themselves. Because it's not always about regulation. Some of the best stewards of the land are the farmers and property owners. So let's also like respect that as well.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. Well, let me ask this. This is a question a viewer posted. Looking at reform, what would be a needed step? Kind of getting more tangible or practical, I guess. Looking at what is a most important next step, for the different things that you've outlined. You outlined several in the book, and like I mentioned, there's some key issues that at the end of each chapter that you outline and encourage kind of action steps. What would be a important first step for a regulator, for a leader, for be it on the federal side or even maybe on the state side?
Well, look, I mean, I think the biggest thing needs to happen is Congress needs to do its job. It needs to amend these major environmental statutes. So we can have the administration doing good things, or what you wind up having is these administrations going back and forth depending on what political party is in power. So then you have one good rule and then a bad rule, good rule, bad rule. You're just going back and forth. There's no predictability, especially when it comes to the water issues for farmers. You're like, the good news for, I think, on the water side is the Supreme Court provides some clarity. So that's helpful. But really, Congress needs to amend the statutes. I think, especially in the Clean Air Act specifically, I do think it would be ideal if we didn't regulate greenhouse gases through the Clean Air Act. But you said a small step or something, then again, I think one area would be to at least require the agency to consider costs and its trade-offs when it's regulating, and also to create some guardrails on what the agency can do when it comes to regulating. On the criteria pollutants, these are, I mean, because honestly, we're talking about rules that potentially be hundreds of billions of dollars potentially, depending on what rules we're talking about. Um, Hundreds of billions. Actually, it just hit me. The de facto EV mandate is like a, you know, hundreds of billions, 700 billion. I might be wrong. I mean, I think it's even more. Type of rule. We're talking about things are like what? So again, I think Congress has to reassert its power. This is bigger than the EPA, but I think what would happen is like on the national, I mean, so the criteria pollutants. I said the agency has to review and revise every 5 years. I think that you don't have to do it every 5 years. I think that what we want to do is, I think Congress should be the one making the decision on when it's setting these standards and allowing states ultimately, if they want to go beyond the federal standard to do that. That's something that could be done.
Yeah, no, that's good. Are there anything now? The title of the book is Modernizing the EPA. Maybe what is one or two, and building off of what you just shared, but one or two things that the EPA needs to do to modernize their structure and setup, to modernize the way they address science, to modernize the way in which they are transparent and handle accountability. Can you talk about, maybe one or two key reforms to modernize the EPA?
Yeah, I mean, I'll get to what the agency can do. I know I'm a broken record, right? It's really Congress that has to modernize the agency. It's the agency is regulating as if it's 1975 as opposed to 2025. The Congress has to change and alter the statutes to reflect the reality that is actually, well, the reality when it comes to air, water, whatever it might be, and also kind of recognizing some of the look after 50 years, you start to learn some lessons. I don't know, maybe it should happen a little sooner than 50 years, but certainly after 50 years, you have plenty of lessons. And I think it's important for Congress to make some changes to modernize it. And I think these statutes in particular, that we should be amending the statutes to address the problems that have been created, that have hurt farmers, that have hurt property owners, that have devastated the economy and placed well-being and growth and human flourishing well below their kind of more extreme environmental objectives. Now, we're not saying you don't want to improve the environment. Of course, we want the environment to be cleaner, but we also want to have proper consideration of the costs and trade-offs, as I've said. Now, the agency itself, I mean, again, there's some good things that can be done. Any future administration can undo it. I do think that one key thing is that the agency, the EPA, should do on its own. First of all, I should clarify the Trump administration has done a lot of great things when it comes to undoing Biden administration rules and also helping to the Trump administration is getting rid of something or proposing to get rid of something called the endangerment finding. That is this is probably beyond the scope here, but it's basically the predicate for the ability of the agency to regulate greenhouse gases. So if there's a finding that these emissions don't endanger public health and welfare, and there is specific statutory language that actually would suggest that it's actually not that clear cut that endangers public health and welfare, regardless of what your view is. Then maybe the administration by itself will be able to address greenhouse gas regulations, and that's what the Trump administration is trying to do. The other thing it should do, and we talked about this right from the start, is to improve the science that's used at the agency. The agency certainly can do that. President Trump issued an executive order called Gold Standard Science. It's supposed to apply across the agency, so the EPA needs to apply that. And they need to kind of go back to, look, the Trump administration, the first term, had the right idea on promoting transparency when it comes to science. You need to go back and move on it quickly. It's not just you want to move on it quickly because as the administration want to defend the rule in court once the other environmental groups or whoever it might be sue and challenge you on the rule. So they need to do it quickly. So like now, basically.
Yeah, no. One that is very helpful. It kind of gets our mind in that right area. But I know the book and really our discussion has focused really heavily on leadership, and on that leadership that really has the authority and the duty and responsibility to regulate this agency and make sure that they are operating within, I really like that perspective. We're operating within the 2025 understanding of reality, not the 1975 understanding of reality, for one. But are there any steps that citizens can do? We hear that, yes, we hear we should be in contact with our leaders, reach out to our leaders, share our voice that way. And I don't want to downplay that. And that is a very vital and important step in our representative democracy. And I'm grateful for that. But are there any key steps that citizens can do, that farmers can do in our case, in this set, especially those in kind of agricultural, rural communities? Anything that we can do to help be a part of that solution, help hold
Yeah,
hold the EPA accountable?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, it's true. Reach contact your lawmakers. That's true. And whatever your views are, contact your lawmakers. But the EPA will be issuing rules right now. There's a public comment period, and it's important to submit comments. We were just talking about WOTUS, and I know the people watching this are going to be concerned with how waters in the United States is defined. The WOTUS rule will be coming out soon. There will be a public comment period. People should submit their comments and can try to explain in practical terms, tell their own story about how the overreach has hurt them, and how it should be, to try to, make your arguments, but connect it. You can probably connect it to kind of your own experiences as well. I don't know whether or not there are going to be public hearings on the WOTUS rule or not, but there might be. So that'd be something to participate in it if there are. That's just WOTUS rule. But then there's other rules that the agency will be issuing and have issued. Unfortunately, agencies are always coming up with rules. Fortunately, though, with the Trump administration, they're usually undoing some problematic rules. The other thing is, beyond just telling, kind of communicating some of the challenges that you have. Let people know about some of the overreach that exists. Like, even though, for example, the Sackett versus EPA case was issued, I'm hearing and I've been told property owners are still kind of dealing with some really abusive actions by the Corps and or the EPA, and that's a problem. So it's important to kind of communicate those concerns and talk to not just lawmakers, but to kind of communicate with different groups and groups in the agriculture community about these problems.
No, that is wise. That is wise. Well, let me ask this. So as we kind of wrap up the conversation a little bit, what is kind of the next step with, you've published this book, the report is out, the key issues and the findings are there. So what is next for you with this? Where do you take it, and kind of what are you watching to help maybe guide and see, how effective the research that your team has put together, is it being received? Is it being addressed? Are there solutions being implemented, et cetera? What is the next step for you?
Yeah, I mean, the good news is, we're hearing from the Hill. There's an interest in a lot of the ideas, and it's important for us to be on offense. We can't just release the book and then, all right, that's it, move on. So we try to reach out and work with lawmakers and others who are interested in these ideas and trying to turn it into actual tangible, like, legislation, or to the extent the administration is interested in these ideas, we hope that it helps inform rules or whatever it is that they're doing. At CEI, we played a huge role in, we need to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act, but there are few subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act to push for harmful energy related policies. I'll just say that. And we've been advocating for dismantling a lot of those harmful policies. One of the chapters in this book talks about getting rid of a lot of these IRA, Inflation Reduction Act programs that the EPA administers. And I can say that a lot of that happened in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, at least to an extent, a large extent. A lot of the programs were just defunded. So that was great. So we're already seeing some successes already. And the kind of behind the inside baseball, explanation is, and look in the think tank world, which I work at a think tank, is it's very important to develop like additional derivative products. So like you write the book, and then it's important to write op-eds that help to promote the book, or you write a paper that's based off one of the chapters in the book. So you're constantly working and promoting these types of things through different types of publications, through webinars like today's, and other ways, and reports, and whatever it might be. So we're out there, and we're being very aggressive and being on offense to try to make these recommendations a reality. And some of these recommendations we see as might be years, in the making. Or others, other recommendations are things that can happen right now.
That makes sense. Well, I do want to encourage those that are watching to, again, I'm going to put up on the screen the QR code for the book, Modernizing the EPA, a Blueprint for Congress. One step I might encourage is individuals, check out the book, look through it, share it with others that you may have connections with, share it with your legislators that you may have outlets for, have a voice to. Use this as a tool to share and promote. So use that QR code there and be able to access the book as you're able. I want to definitely encourage that. Darren, let me, as we kind of wrap up, let me just ask, is there any closing thought that you might have for those that are viewing this, both today and we anticipate others that will be watching this in the days to come? Any thoughts that you would leave with
First of all, I want to thank you again for inviting me, and I think it's great what you're doing, Safe Family Farming. This is a huge issue. These EPA is an agency that's in many ways different than maybe a lot of others. I talk about cost a lot, and you might be thinking just about dollar signs, and that's true. But really, I guess the takeaway would be a lot of these regulations are dictating how you live your life at the most basic level. What kind of cars you drive, whether or not you're going to be able to actually even have reliable electricity, and could go further. I mean, I could see a very real possibility that the EPA could start to regulate in things that can affect in agriculture directly, even unrelated to kind of the water context, but like methane emissions. And you might even start to see ways that they try to limit animal agriculture. So who knows? It's a possibility. If I talk to you, we had a webinar 7 or 8 years ago, and I tell you the Biden EPA is going to basically try to kill off gas-powered cars, you'd say I was an idiot and I was a nut. But here we are. And so that's a concern. So I'd be worried about what they're doing. And quite honestly, we've already seen like the Biden EPA trying to push climate smart ag practices. So like they're trying to micromanage how farmers farm, and they're using climate as the pretext for doing so. So I'd be concerned about that. And I do think instead of sitting back and letting this happen, I think it's important to push back against this kind of extremism.
No. I couldn't agree more with that, especially that last comment, that really that is the perspective that Safe Family Farming, we really want to take on more of that, play that offensive role and say, how can we be proactive and engage both in a truth-based, grounded in science and reality based approach, but let's stand up for truth. Let's stand up for reality. And in that process, let's stand up for our farmers who are actually feeding and providing for us day in and day out. So with that, Darren, thank you so much. Thank you for your work on this book. I know it was a team effort, but thank you for your work on this. Thank you for your leadership in CEI and your work promoting and providing information and research on energy and environment. Really do appreciate it. And thank you for taking some time with us this morning. It means a lot.
Well, thank you, Ben.
Absolutely. I do want to encourage those that are watching this. You are welcome to and encouraged to check out Safe Family Farming. If you have any questions, or if you have any questions about the information that was shared and want a little more information from us, check out our website, www.safefamilyfarming.org. You can also email us at info@safefamilyfarming.org. That is an excellent way to get in touch with us. And if any of the information has sparked you, you want to stay in touch, check out, we have our weekly podcast radio show, The Farming Show, where we outline issues and information that is addressing and impacting agriculture every week. If you are interested also in taking that proactive step forward and making a difference, I do want to just promote, we have a upcoming event on December 13th, Cultivating Leadership, a candidate training for agricultural advocates. We are promoting and putting out basically a campaign school for individuals that are interested in getting engaged in the political process, engaging and potentially running for office, or engaging in a campaign or supporting someone's campaign that is working to be a pro-agriculture candidate in our region. This would be a powerful way to empower and enable individuals who want the tools to really run a successful campaign. And with that, I would like to just thank everyone for tuning in to the webinar this morning. Again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out, info@safefamilyfarming.org, or check us out online. Again, a big thank you to Darren for his leadership and joining us this morning. And we look forward to tuning in with you next time and hope to hear from you soon. Take care.